They thought they knew the enemy. In 1941, Japan's military command believed they had mastered the Pacific. They measured everything: resources, men, ships, planes, and concluded one thing with certainty: America was vast but slow. Industrially powerful, yes, but unready, unwilling, and uncoordinated. Their estimates said the United States Navy could put 296,000 sailors into the Pacific. That number to Japan was manageable. It meant they could fight, strike first, and finish the war before America could react. It meant victory was possible. So they moved fast. They planned the attack on Pearl Harbor not out of madness, but calculation. They believed that by striking hard, they could paralyze a sleeping giant before it ever woke. The Japanese admirals like Yamamoto and Nagumo looked at charts showing American bases, fuel supplies, and fleet strength. The numbers looked safe. 296 sailors across the entire Pacific meant that even if the U.S. mobilized, it would take months to bring enough manpower to matter. But numbers in war can lie. When the bombs fell on Pearl Harbor, the world changed in a single morning. Japan saw flames rise from battleships and believed they had broken the enemy's spine. They thought the Pacific was theirs for at least 2 years. Their war planners toasted to victory, confident that America wouldn't recover soon. What they didn't know was that they had just awakened something no calculation could measure. America wasn't just a collection of bases and ships. It was an industrial storm waiting to be unleashed. Within days, the United States began a mobilization effort the world had never seen before. Factories that once built cars and refrigerators were retooled overnight to produce destroyers, landing craft, and aircraft engines. Recruitment stations overflowed. By 1942, thousands of men were volunteering daily. By 1943, entire towns had turned into production lines for war. In Tokyo, Japan's intelligence network started to notice small hints. Reports from submarines and spies told them new American ships were appearing in numbers that didn't make sense. The docks at San Diego, Bremerton, and Norfolk were busier than anyone expected. But Japan's planners dismissed these as exaggerations. The idea that the U.S. could field over 2 million sailors seemed impossible. They had done their math. They believed their math. But the truth was that America's math had changed. Every ship launched added hundreds of new sailors. Every convoy of supplies meant thousands more were trained to crew them. And America didn't just rely on volunteers. It called upon every resource, every industry, every ounce of manpower. The Pacific began to tilt. By mid-1943, Japan's early victories began to crumble. Guadalcanal, the Solomon Islands, the Coral Sea. Each battle cost Japan ships it couldn't replace and pilots it couldn't train fast enough. But what terrified Japanese analysts most wasn't the losses. It was the speed at which America replaced theirs. Battleships lost at Pearl Harbor returned to service. Aircraft carriers multiplied like shadows. Every island taken revealed another wave of ships waiting behind it. In their headquarters, Japanese strategists gathered around maps, counting figures that no longer added up. They tried to estimate American naval strength again. Their numbers were old, based on pre-war assumptions, on limited spy reports, on logic that no longer applied. Then, as 1944 approached, the truth began to dawn. Satellite imagery didn't exist back then. They relied on sighting reports, submarines surfacing at night to count silhouettes of ships under moonlight, pilots glimpsing convoys from miles away. What they saw didn't fit any known data. Convoys stretched beyond the horizon, carriers escorted by carriers, destroyers numbered in the hundreds, troop transports filled with men. It was then that one terrifying report reached Tokyo. A senior intelligence officer presented the numbers: estimated U.S. Navy personnel in the Pacific Theater, 2,034,343. The room fell silent. That figure didn't justify their calculations, it destroyed them. If that number was accurate, Japan wasn't fighting an opponent. It was facing an ocean that had come alive. 2 million sailors meant the U.S. had turned the Pacific into a factory of war. It meant the Japanese Navy, once proud and unmatched, was now outnumbered 7-1. And worse, America's momentum was still accelerating. In Washington, President Roosevelt's administration had already committed to total war. American shipyards ran day and night, launching vessels faster than Japan could sink them. In 1943 alone, the U.S. produced more warships than Japan had built in its entire history. The Japanese Naval High Command began to realize something chilling: they had already lost the war. They just hadn't seen it yet. Back on the front lines, sailors on both sides fought with courage and desperation. In the Pacific heat, battles were fought not just with ships and planes, but with sheer endurance. The island campaigns were brutal, each one closer to Japan's home shores. And with each victory, America's numbers grew. Every island captured became another forward base. Every new airfield meant the next target was closer. Japan's fleet, once the most advanced in the world, was being hunted. The loss of carriers at Midway had already crippled their offensive power. By the time they faced the U.S. at Leyte Gulf, they weren't fighting as an equal force anymore. They were fighting as ghosts of a once great navy. But the moment they knew, the exact moment they truly understood it was over, came not in battle, but in a briefing room, when the figure 2034-343 appeared on the intelligence report. No one spoke for several minutes. The silence was heavier than defeat. That number meant Japan's empire could never survive. It meant that for every Japanese sailor, there were 7 Americans. For every ship lost, the U.S. could build 5 more. The Pacific wasn't a war zone anymore. It was an assembly line, and Japan was standing on the wrong side of it. And yet, even knowing that, they fought on, not out of hope, but out of duty. The war would grind on for 2 more years, but from that moment, the outcome was already written. The realization came too late. By the time Japan understood the true scale of the American fleet, the Pacific had already transformed into something unrecognizable. The ocean that once belonged to the Empire of Japan was now ruled by a tide of steel smoke and unstoppable rhythm, the rhythm of American production. In 1942, Japan could count every carrier it owned on one hand. Each was precious, irreplaceable, the pride of its navy. The Akagi, Kaga, Shokaku, Zuikaku. Each one represented years of careful construction, resources mined from across Asia, and the most skilled shipbuilders the empire could find. Losing one meant a wound that might never heal. America, on the other hand, had learned something terrifyingly efficient: war could be built like an industry. In shipyards along both coasts, welding sparks replaced sunrise. The air smelled of steel and oil. Workers who had never seen the ocean before were now building the vessels that would dominate it. Women joined the factories by the millions, welding hulls, riveting armor, assembling engines. They didn't need to know naval tactics. They only needed to know one thing: build faster than the enemy can destroy. Every week, new ships slid into the water. Liberty ships, escort carriers, destroyers. So many that sailors joked they could walk from California to Hawaii without getting their feet wet. By the time Japan tried to rebuild after Midway, America had already launched a new generation of ships that hadn't even existed on paper a year earlier. The U.S. Navy wasn't just replenishing, it was multiplying. The Japanese Navy, which had been trained for decisive strikes, couldn't comprehend this kind of war. They were fighting an opponent that didn't fear losses anymore. At Midway, Japan lost 4 carriers in one day. For most nations, that would have been the end of a navy. But by the following year, America had launched more than 10 new carriers to replace them. Behind every American sailor stood an entire factory of people who never wore uniforms but were just as much soldiers. Machinists, engineers, truck drivers, clerks, shipwrights. That's how the number 24343 came to exist. It wasn't an army that Japan could see on a battlefield. It was an army made of logistics, planning, and endless resources. Every crate of ammunition, every drum of fuel, every meal. All of it was delivered with machine-like precision. The United States had turned the Pacific into an industrial network, an oceanic highway of supply lines that kept its navy invincible. Japan, meanwhile, was running out of everything. Oil shipments from Indonesia grew dangerous. American submarines prowled trade routes like wolves, sinking tankers faster than they could be replaced. Factories in Japan were starved of raw materials. Aircraft production slowed. Training new pilots became a desperate race against time. And still Japan refused to surrender. The belief in the emperor's divinity and the code of Bushido demanded resistance to the very end. The admirals clung to the hope of one last, decisive battle, a single massive engagement that could shatter American morale. But that battle never came. Instead, what came was a rolling wall of destruction. Relentless island hopping, bombardments, and amphibious invasions that seemed to appear out of nowhere. Each new invasion force carried with it an armada so large that Japanese defenders often couldn't believe what they were seeing. At Saipan, at Guam, at the Philippines, every horizon burned with the silhouettes of hundreds of American ships. One Japanese officer described it in his diary: "We thought we were facing their entire navy." Then, days later, another fleet appeared. And another. It was as if the ocean itself was giving birth to them. That's what the number 234-3043 truly meant. It wasn't just a statistic. It was the sum of an empire's nightmare. The proof that Japan was fighting against something beyond human scale. Even the commanders of the Imperial Japanese Navy began to lose faith. Admiral Toyota and the surviving officers of the combined fleet knew they could no longer protect their islands. They could barely fuel their ships. Destroyers became transport vessels. Battleships were used as stationary artillery. When the Yamato, the largest battleship ever built, was ordered on its final mission, A one-way suicide run to Okinawa? Everyone knew it was symbolic. Japan had built the most powerful warship in history, but it was powerless against an enemy that built faster than it could destroy. For the Americans, the war had become a machine. Every movement of that machine was calculated. The Pacific was divided into theaters, every island given a number, every attack timed to the hour. The coordination between land, sea, and air forces was so precise that Japan could no longer predict where to defend. And the people behind it, those 343 sailors, were more than just numbers. They were trained, disciplined, and backed by the belief that their country could not lose. Every sailor knew he was part of something massive, something unbreakable. They didn't fight for territory anymore. They fought for total victory. By 1944, America had achieved what Japan thought impossible: naval dominance across the entire Pacific. Convoys stretched from California to Manila. Every island captured became a launch pad for the next offensive. Japan's isolation was complete. Their planes could barely reach American fleets before running out of fuel. Their submarines were hunted down one by one. The skies, once filled with Japanese Zeros, now belonged to the Hellcats, Corsairs, and Avengers. In Tokyo, the War Council still met daily, but their discussions had changed. They no longer planned invasions, they calculated survival. Every meeting began with casualty reports, every chart marked with losses. When the intelligence officers brought in the revised American manpower report, confirming the U.S. Navy now operated over 2 million sailors, it wasn't a surprise anymore. It was confirmation of what everyone already felt in their bones. The empire that once dreamed of ruling Asia now fought to defend its own coasts. Even Emperor Hirohito began to realize the truth. He received updates from his admirals describing fleets so large that even the most loyal officers questioned whether their reports would be believed. And through it all, the United States kept moving forward, not with arrogance, but with the certainty of a nation that knew how to win. The war was no longer about who had the strongest ships or the bravest men. It was about who could endure longer, who could replace what was lost, who could outlast the other. And in that war of endurance, Japan had already fallen. The estimate of 296,000 U.S. sailors, once seen as manageable, now felt like a memory from another world. Japan's entire strategy had been built on that number, and that number had betrayed them. When they counted 343, they weren't counting men anymore. They were counting inevitability. The Pacific had turned silent, but it was the silence that follows thunder. By 1945, Japan's empire had become a shadow. The war that began with confidence and calculation now dragged on through exhaustion and inevitability. The admirals who once studied maps of conquest were now surrounded by maps marked in red. Lost territories, sunken fleets, ruined airfields. The dream of dominance had drowned beneath waves of American steel. The Imperial Japanese Navy was no longer a navy. It was fragments. Ships that once carried the pride of the nation now lay rusting beneath the sea. The battleship Yamato, that symbol of Japanese engineering and defiance, sailed for its final mission on April 7, 1945. It had barely enough fuel for a one-way trip. Its orders were simple: reach Okinawa Beach itself and fight as a stationary gun platform until destroyed. Every man aboard knew it was suicide. They went anyway. When American reconnaissance planes spotted Yamato's group, the response was immediate. Hundreds of bombers and torpedo planes launched from multiple carriers. The sky above the fleet darkened with aircraft. Within 2 hours, the Yamato was gone, torn apart by explosions, broken in half, swallowed by the ocean. Of her 300 crew, only a few hundred survived. For Japan, that moment wasn't just a military loss. It was the death of an illusion. The illusion that bravery could overcome production, that faith could outlast industry. In Tokyo, reports from across the Pacific arrived daily, each one worse than the last. The Americans had landed on Iwo Jima, then Okinawa. The sky above Japan itself now hummed with the sound of B-29 bombers. Every night, cities burned. And yet, the empire's leaders hesitated to surrender. Pride held them hostage. They still hoped that inflicting enough damage might force a negotiated peace. But deep inside their command, they knew the truth. The numbers no longer lied. Every time an American convoy appeared, it carried not hundreds but thousands of ships. Every island fortress Japan had built was swallowed by a flood of men and machines. Entire divisions vanished beneath bombardments that shook the ground like earthquakes. The 343 sailors weren't just crewing ships anymore. They were maintaining a global machine. Their presence was everywhere, on carriers, destroyers, transports, supply ships, hospital ships. They ran ports, managed logistics, handled communications, built docks, and delivered supplies to every corner of the Pacific. The American Navy had become a living ecosystem, self-sustaining, self-reinforcing. For Japan, that number became a symbol of despair. Their entire empire at its peak couldn't match that single statistic. When American forces prepared for the invasion of Okinawa, the Japanese knew it was the beginning of the end. They poured every remaining aircraft into suicide missions. The kamikaze, young pilots, some barely trained, climbed into planes with just enough fuel for a one-way flight. Their mission was to crash into ships to turn their lives into weapons. It was desperation made visible. At first, the attacks shocked the Americans. Ships burned, men died, but even then the tide didn't change. For every ship hit, more arrived. For every sailor lost, another took his place. That's what Japan couldn't understand. The U.S. Navy's strength wasn't just in its numbers, it was in its replacement power. The machine never stopped. The Japanese high command began to crumble under the pressure. Supply chains collapsed, fuel reserves dried up, communications between islands failed. Admirals who once issued orders to fleets now commanded only silence. The Pacific, once filled with the rising sun flag, now flew the stars and stripes from island to island. In the final months of the war, Japan's naval bases became graveyards. At Kure, Sasebo, Yokosuka, hulks of once mighty ships lay in the shallows, their decks twisted, their guns silent. The air smelled of rust and smoke. The empire had built for war but never for defeat. And still, the Americans came. They weren't driven by hatred, they were driven by necessity. Every battle, every bombardment was one step closer to ending a war that had consumed the world. For the men on both sides, it was no longer about strategy. It was survival. Japanese soldiers fought until their last bullet. American Marines advanced through fields of fire that seemed endless. Civilians were caught in between, their cities erased by firebombing, their homes reduced to ashes. When Tokyo finally received confirmation that America had deployed over 2 million naval personnel in the Pacific, the empire's remaining leaders faced an impossible truth. The number wasn't just military. It was existential. It meant that Japan was outnumbered, outproduced, and outlasted beyond imagination. That number echoed in the war rooms, in the emperor's palace, and in the hearts of the soldiers who still stood guard on the beaches. Then came Hiroshima. The bomb wasn't just a weapon. It was a message. A demonstration that the war had crossed into a realm beyond humanity's understanding. And when Nagasaki followed, the message became undeniable. The empire that once believed it could measure victory through mathematics, through estimates and projections, was destroyed by something that couldn't be measured at all. On August 15, 1945, Emperor Hirohito's voice was broadcast to the nation. His words, calm but trembling, carried across a country in ruins. He spoke of enduring the unendurable. For the first time in history, the Japanese people heard their emperor's voice, a voice that admitted defeat. But in truth, Japan had already lost long before the bombs fell. The moment they counted those 43 American sailors, their fate was sealed. That count wasn't just a number, it was a prophecy fulfilled. It represented every factory worker in Detroit, every welder in Seattle, every farmer who left his field to join the Navy, every woman who riveted armor plates under blinding sparks. It represented the entire industrial heart of a nation that refused to be conquered. Japan had been prepared for a war of ships but not for a war of wills. And in that contest, America's will proved infinite. The ocean that once belonged to the empire now carried American convoys without fear. The rising sun that once symbolized power now sank behind smoke and silence. And in the ruins of Tokyo, Japan's surviving officers sat in rooms filled with the scent of paper and dust, signing documents that ended the greatest naval war in history. They signed not because they were defeated in battle, but because they had been defeated by numbers. In the end, there was no roar of cannons, no grand final battle. Just silence, the silence of a realizing that numbers can crush even the proudest empire. The war that began with an estimate of 296 Nalos and U.S. sailors ended with a count of 343. Those numbers told the story better than any headline, any speech, any monument ever could. They were the measure of human will turned into machinery, of industry turned into inevitability. For Japan, the war had been about precision, strategy, speed, and surprise. For America, it became about momentum, endurance, and scale. Japan had believed it could outthink the enemy. America simply outbuilt it. That was the difference. Each new ship launched was a statement, we are coming. Each convoy that crossed the Pacific said, you cannot stop us. And when Japan finally realized what those numbers meant, when they counted 234, 3D-43 sailors across an endless sea of steel, they understood that the war had already ended long before they admitted defeat. It wasn't the bombs that broke Japan first. It was arithmetic. The empire's leaders had based everything on assumptions, on old intelligence, on a belief that the American spirit could be measured by time, distance, and fear. But the Americans had something else. An engine of belief that turned civilians into warriors, factories into arsenals, and oceans into highways. Even in defeat, Japanese officers couldn't help but feel a grim respect. They hadn't been beaten by luck or deceit. They had been overwhelmed by a civilization that understood how to turn its collective will into motion. After the surrender, when American ships filled Tokyo Bay, Japanese officers stood on the decks of their remaining vessels and stared in silence. The horizon was filled with metal, rows upon rows of ships, each bristling with men, guns, and flags. There were so many that the sea seemed smaller. One officer wrote later, "I understood then. The war had never been about courage. It was about capacity. We were brave, but they were infinite." Those words captured the truth of the Pacific War better than any report ever could. The Japanese had estimated 296 Thousand, a manageable number, a number they could fight. But when they counted 343, they saw the future. They saw that the Pacific had become America's ocean. They saw that no empire could stand against an enemy that never stopped coming. And in that realization, in that cold, inescapable number, Japan saw the end of its own age. Because in war, numbers don't just count soldiers, they count destiny.